In June 1988, 21-year-old Althea Oakeley walked home alone from a fraternity party near the University of New Mexico. She loved music. She dreamed of teaching. She trusted people. That night, neighbors on Buena Vista Drive heard screams piercing the darkness. Police found her stabbed to death outside a home, her life stolen in moments. 1 year later, 18-year-old Kaitlyn Arquette was shot while driving home from a friend's house. Her car drifted into a light pole. Her mother, author Lois Duncan, would spend decades searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. For more than 30 years, these murders haunted Albuquerque. No arrests, no justice, families aged with grief. Then, in July 2021, a man walked into a police station and said he had information about murders no one could forget. What he confessed would shatter the silence that had lasted a generation. But how does a community reckon with truth that arrives 3 decades too late? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The summer heat pressed down on Albuquerque like a weight. June nights in 1988 brought little relief from the desert Sunday students at the University of New Mexico packed into fraternity houses, celebrating the end of another semester. Music thumped through open windows. Laughter spilled onto lawns. Young people felt invincible in those moments, wrapped in friendship and freedom. Althea Oakeley stood on the porch of one such house, her dark hair catching the porch light. She was 21, a junior studying education. Her friends knew her as the quiet one who always listened, who remembered birthdays, who brought homemade cookies to study groups. She had argued with her boyfriend inside. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of friction that happens when 2 people are tired and the night has gone on too long. She decided to walk home. It was late, but not dangerously so, not in her mind. The streets between campus and her apartment were familiar. She had walked them dozens of times. The neighborhood was mixed students and families, old houses converted to rentals, children's bikes left on front lawns. Streetlights created pools of yellow on the sidewalk. Between them, shadows gathered thick and dark. On Buena Vista Drive Southeast, a quiet residential street, something terrible happened. The exact sequence would remain unknown, but neighbors heard screams, sharp, desperate, the kind that makes your blood freeze. A woman called the police. Her hands shook as she dialed. When officers arrived minutes later, they found Althea lying on the ground outside a home. She had been stabbed multiple times. Blood soaked her clothes and spread across the pavement. Paramedics worked frantically, but they already knew. Her injuries were too severe. She died there, under the indifferent stars, while police cars lit the scene with red and blue pulses. The first detective on scene was a veteran, a man who had worked dozens of homicides. He knelt beside Althea's body and felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. This was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had walked out of a party thinking about tomorrow. Now, there would be no tomorrow. He stood and began the work securing the scene, documenting evidence, interviewing neighbors. The investigation clock started ticking. As dawn broke over Albuquerque, the sun revealed a city that had changed overnight. One young woman was dead. A killer walked free. And the question everyone would ask for decades had just been born. Who did this? Morning light brought no comfort. By sunrise, Althea's family had been notified. Her mother collapsed when the police chaplain appeared at her door. Her father simply stared, unable to process the words. Their daughter had been murdered, stabbed to death while walking home. The reality felt impossible, like a nightmare that refused to end. At the University of New Mexico, word spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups, whispering. Professors canceled classes. The dean sent a campus-wide message. Althea's friends huddled together, crying, trying to understand how someone so gentle could meet such violence. Her roommate sat in their apartment, staring at Althea's unmade bed, her textbooks still open on the desk. Local television stations led their morning broadcasts with the murder. A young woman stabbed near campus. Police searching for suspects. Anyone with information should call. The news anchors used that careful tone reserved for tragedies, their voices measured and grave. Reporters stood outside the crime scene, yellow tape still marking the perimeter. They interviewed neighbors who described the screams, the sirens, the horror of realizing what had happened so close to their homes. Tips began pouring into the police department. People called to report suspicious activity, strange cars, men who seemed out of place. Detectives logged every call, following up on each one. This was the crucial period, the first 48 hours when most homicides are solved. Witnesses remember clearly. Evidence is fresh. Suspects make mistakes. But as the day wore on, patterns emerged that troubled investigators. No one had seen Althea with anyone suspicious. No witnesses could describe an attacker. The neighbors who heard screams hadn't looked outside in time to see anything useful. Forensic evidence from the scene was limited. This was 1988, before DNA databases, before advanced forensic techniques that would later become standard. Detectives had fingerprints, some physical evidence, but nothing that pointed clearly to a suspect. A promising lead emerged by afternoon. Someone reported seeing a man running from the area around the time of the screams. Police brought in a sketch artist. A composite drawing took shape, generic features, difficult to identify. They released it to the media, hoping someone would recognize the face. Phones rang, officers chased down names, but each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Wrong place, wrong time, solid alibi, nothing fit. By evening, Althea's murder was still the top story, but a subtle shift had occurred. The certainty that the killer would be caught quickly had started to fade. Detectives worked through the night, but they felt it slipping away. The trail was already growing cold. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then months. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods repeatedly, knocking on doors, showing Althea's photo, asking if anyone remembered anything new. They interviewed her boyfriend extensively. They looked at her classmates, her co-workers at the campus bookstore, anyone who had been at that fraternity party. They found nothing that led to an arrest. The police department released the composite sketch again, plastering it across newspapers and bulletin boards. Someone must know this person, they insisted. Someone must have seen something, but recognition never came. The sketch was too vague, the features too common. It could have been 1,000 men in Albuquerque. Grief consumed Althea's family. Her mother attended every press conference, standing behind the police chief, her face drawn with exhaustion. She pleaded with the public, "If you know anything, please come forward. My daughter was innocent. She was kind. She didn't deserve this." Her voice would crack, and detectives would gently guide her away from the microphones. On campus, students held a vigil. Hundreds gathered, holding candles that flickered in the desert wind. They sang songs Althea had loved. They shared memories. But underneath the solidarity was fear. If this could happen to Althea, careful, smart Althea, it could happen to anyone. Young women began walking in groups. Campus security increased patrols. Self-defense classes filled up. As summer turned to fall, media coverage dwindled. Other stories took precedence. Althea's murder moved from front pages to occasional updates buried in the metro section. The case remained open, but active investigation slowed. Detectives still had other cases, other victims who needed justice. They promised Althea's family they would never give up, but everyone knew the truth. Without new evidence, without a witness, without a confession, the case was effectively cold. The file was stored in a cabinet at police headquarters, one folder among many. Inside were crime scene photos, witness statements, forensic reports, and the sketch that had led nowhere. Detectives would occasionally pull it out, review it, hope for inspiration, but the answers remained hidden. Somewhere in Albuquerque, someone knew what happened to Althea Oakeley. That person said nothing, and the silence grew heavier with each passing month. July 1989 arrived with the same crushing heat. 13 months had passed since Althea's murder. The city had not forgotten, but daily life had resumed its rhythm. People still went to work, attended school, met friends. The fear had dulled to a background hum. Kaitlyn Arquette was 18 years old and full of life. She had just graduated high school and was planning to attend college in the fall. Her mother, Lois Duncan, was a successful author of young adult novels. Kaitlyn was close with her family, especially her mother and her sister Carrie. She was independent, creative, artistic. Friends described her as someone who lit up rooms with her energy. On a warm July evening, Kaitlyn visited a friend's house. It was an ordinary night. They talked, laughed, made plans for the upcoming weekend. Around 9:30, Kaitlyn said goodbye and got into her Volkswagen Beetle. The drive home was short, familiar. She had made it countless times. What happened next would haunt Albuquerque for decades. As Kaitlyn drove through the streets, someone shot her. The bullet tore through her car and struck her. The Volkswagen drifted off course, striking a light pole on Lomas Boulevard. Other drivers saw the crash and rushed to help. When they reached the car, they found Kaitlyn slumped over the steering wheel, critically wounded. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They rushed her to the hospital, sirens wailing through the night. In the emergency room, doctors worked desperately to save her life, but the damage was too severe. The bullet had caused catastrophic injuries. Kaitlyn was declared brain dead. Her family gathered at the hospital, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. She had been driving home. How does someone get shot driving home? The police investigation began immediately. This was no accident. Someone had shot Kaitlyn Arquette. But why? Detectives found no signs of road rage, no evidence of a robbery. Her car had not been forced off the road. The shooting seemed random, senseless. A young woman simply driving home, cut down for no apparent reason. At the hospital, Lois Duncan sat beside her daughter's bed, holding her hand. Machines kept Kaitlyn's body alive, but her mind was gone. The doctors explained the situation gently. There was no hope of recovery. Lois had to make an impossible decision: Eventually, she gave permission to remove life support. Kaitlyn died, surrounded by her family. 18 years old, her future stolen by a bullet. News of Kaitlyn's murder spread quickly. 2 young women, both connected to the university area, both killed within 13 months. The city erupted with fear and speculation. Was there a serial killer targeting young women in Albuquerque? Parents called their daughters home from college. People bought guns. Neighborhood watch groups formed overnight. Lois Duncan, still reeling from shock, found herself thrust into the spotlight. As a well-known author, media outlets swarmed her for interviews. She appeared on local news, her face pale with grief, and begged for anyone with information to come forward. "My daughter was innocent," she said. "Someone knows something. Please help us." The Albuquerque Police Department held a press conference. The chief stood at a podium, flanked by detectives from both Althea's case and Kaitlyn's. He acknowledged the community's fear but cautioned against jumping to conclusions. They had no evidence linking the 2 murders. Different methods, different circumstances. The cases might not be connected at all, but people weren't convinced. 2 young women dead in just over a year? That couldn't be coincidence. Whispers spread through coffee shops and grocery stores. Maybe the police weren't telling them everything. Maybe they were hiding the truth to avoid panic. Trust in law enforcement began to crack. Detectives worked around the clock on Kaitlyn's case. They interviewed her friends, her family, anyone who might have seen something that night. They examined her life for any connection to danger, angry ex-boyfriends, drug involvement, gang connections. They found nothing. Kaitlyn was an ordinary teenager with an ordinary life. She had no enemies. No one had reason to want her dead. The shooting had happened on a public street, yet no witnesses came forward. No one had seen the shooter. No one heard the gunshot. Forensic evidence from the car was minimal. The bullet had passed through, leaving investigators with little to work with. Once again, the trail was cold almost from the start. Lois Duncan refused to accept silence. She began conducting her own investigation, hiring private detectives, speaking with journalists, documenting everything. She became convinced that police were missing something, that Kaitlyn's death was not random. She started writing notes, keeping files, interviewing people herself. Her grief transformed into determination. She would find out who killed her daughter, even if she had to do it alone. The following months blurred together for Lois Duncan. She attended police briefings that revealed little. She fielded calls from reporters. She tried to comfort her other children while drowning in her own grief. But mostly, she searched for answers. She hired private investigators who pursued leads police had dismissed. She spoke with psychics, hoping for anything that might provide a clue. She challenged official conclusions, questioning why certain suspects weren't pursued more aggressively. She became a thorn in the side of the investigation, a mother who refused to be placated. Detectives appreciated her determination but also found it exhausting. They were doing everything they could, they insisted, but without witnesses, without solid evidence. Their hands were tied. They had multiple suspects, people with connections to drugs, to violence, but no proof. Suspicion was not enough for an arrest. Lois began writing a book about her daughter's murder and her search for truth. She titled it, "Who Killed My Daughter?" and poured every ounce of her pain and frustration into its pages. The book would eventually be published, bringing national attention to Kaitlyn's case. Lois appeared on television shows, gave interviews, made it impossible for people to forget her daughter. Meanwhile, Althea Oakeley's case faded further into the background. Her family, less visible than the famous author, grieved privately. They attended occasional meetings with detectives, but the news was always the same: no new leads, no breaks. The investigation was stalled. As 1989 turned to 1990, both cases remained unsolved. 2 families lived with unbearable loss. 2 young women were buried, their killers still free. And somewhere in Albuquerque, someone carried the weight of terrible secrets. The 1990s passed in a fog of occasional updates and dead ends. Detectives rotated through the cold case files. New officers would review Althea's and Kaitlyn's murders, hoping fresh eyes might spot something missed, but the evidence remained the same. The witnesses were still silent. The truth stayed hidden. Lois Duncan never stopped. She maintained contact with journalists, kept her daughter's story alive in the public consciousness. She attended conferences on unsolved murders. She networked with other families seeking justice. Her book became a touchstone for advocates of victims' rights. Althea's family held annual vigils on the anniversary of her death. Each year, fewer people attended. The city had moved on. Even if they hadn't, they placed flowers at the site where she died. They lit candles. They whispered prayers. They hoped that somehow, somewhere, someone would finally speak up. The 2000s brought new forensic technologies. Cold case units formed in police departments across the country, dedicated to solving old crimes with modern tools. The Albuquerque Police Department had such a unit, and both Althea's and Kaitlyn's cases were periodically reviewed. But advances in technology meant nothing without viable evidence to test. The physical evidence from both crime scenes was limited. What existed had been collected using 1980s methods. DNA databases were growing, but they only helped if you had a match. The cases remained frustratingly stagnant. By 2010, more than 20 years had passed. Althea would have been in her 40s. Kaitlyn would have been approaching 30. Their families imagined the lives they should have lived. Careers, marriages, children. The loss was not just of who they were, but of who they would have become. Detectives who had worked the original cases were retiring. They handed off files to younger officers who had been children when the murders occurred. The institutional memory was fading. The urgency had long since dissipated. The files sat in storage, gathering dust, waiting for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing year. In 2012, the Albuquerque Police Department made a decision. They would formally reopen Althea Oakeley's case. New DNA testing methods had emerged that might extract information from old evidence. It was a long shot, but worth trying. Detectives pulled Althea's file from storage. They spread the contents across a conference table. Photos, reports, evidence logs. 24 years had passed. The case was older than some of the officers reviewing it. They sent evidence to a lab for new analysis. Weeks turned to months. The family was notified of the development. Althea's mother, now elderly and frail, allowed herself to hope, maybe this time, maybe finally. But when results came back, they offered little help. DNA profiles were developed, but they didn't match anyone in the national database. Without a suspect to compare against, the profiles were just data. Valuable if they ever arrested someone, but useless for identifying an unknown killer. The investigation sputtered again. Detectives conducted new interviews with people who had been questioned decades earlier. Memories had faded, details had become fuzzy, some witnesses had died, others had moved away. The trail was not just cold, it was frozen solid. Around the same time, advocacy groups across New Mexico began pushing for the processing of thousands of untested rape kits. These kits, collected from sexual assault victims over decades, sat in evidence rooms, never submitted for DNA analysis. The backlog was shameful, advocates argued. How many criminals went free because evidence was ignored? The campaign gained momentum. Lawmakers passed legislation mandating kit testing. Lab capacity expanded. Slowly, kits began to be processed. Some contained DNA that matched profiles in criminal databases. Cold cases were being solved. Justice, delayed for years, was finally arriving. Detectives working Althea's and Kaitlyn's cases watched these developments with interest. Could their cases benefit from this renewed focus on old evidence? They submitted additional materials for testing. They cross-referenced databases. They hoped for a connection, a name, anything. Still, nothing came. The databases expanded daily, but the matches they needed never appeared. The cases remained unsolved, frustrating everyone who touched them. Between 2015 and 2020, the cold case unit continued its work. Detectives balanced new homicides with old ones, trying to give attention to cases that had haunted the city for decades. Althea's and Kaitlyn's files were reviewed regularly. Officers read through statements, studied photos, searched for patterns missed by predecessors. They revisited the theory that the cases might be connected. Different methods, yes, but both victims were young women in the same area. Could one person be responsible? They built timelines, compared evidence, looked for links. The connections remained speculative, nothing they could act on. Other cold cases from the 1980s and 1990s were being solved across the country. A suspect arrested on unrelated charges would have DNA that matched an old crime scene. A witness with guilty knowledge would finally come forward. Technology would identify a killer who had evaded justice for decades. Each success gave hope that Albuquerque's unsolved murders might see similar breakthroughs. But for Althea's and Kaitlyn's families, hope had become a painful thing. Each update from police raised expectations. Each dead end crushed them anew. They learned to manage their emotions, to not invest too much in possibilities. They lived with uncertainty as a constant companion. In 2016, Lois Duncan passed away. She had spent 27 years searching for her daughter's killer. She had written books, given interviews, challenged authorities, and never stopped asking questions. Her death marked the end of an era. The most visible advocate for Kaitlyn's case was gone. Kaitlyn Arquette, Kaitlyn's sister, stepped more fully into the role her mother had occupied. She maintained contact with detectives. She kept her sister's memory alive. She represented the family at events and interviews. The burden of advocacy passed to a new generation. The city of Albuquerque changed around these frozen cases. Neighborhoods evolved. Buildings came down and went up. People who had been children in 1988 now had children of their own, but the murders remained, dark spots in the city's history that refused to fade. Detectives in the cold case unit felt the weight of that history. They knew these victims' stories. They had studied their lives, their final moments. They wanted desperately to bring answers to the families. But wanting was not enough. They needed evidence. They needed a break. July 2021 arrived hot and quiet. Albuquerque was emerging from pandemic lockdowns. Life was slowly returning to something resembling normal. The cold case unit continued its work, reviewing files, following slim leads. On a Tuesday afternoon, a man walked into the University of New Mexico police station. He was 53 years old, disheveled, with the worn look of someone who had lived a hard life. He told the officer at the front desk that he had information about murders, old murders, murders that had never been solved. The officer, initially skeptical, asked for details. The man said names. Althea Oakeley, Kaitlyn Arquette, Stella Gonzalez. The officer's expression changed. He asked the man to wait, and immediately contacted detectives. Paul Raymond Apodaca sat in a chair in the station lobby, his hands trembling slightly. He had been arrested for a probation violation, and was supposed to turn himself in, but something had broken inside him. Secrets he had carried for decades had become too heavy. He was here to confess. Detectives arrived quickly. They guided Apodaca into an interview room. They advised him of his rights. He waived them. He wanted to talk. He needed to talk. They turned on recording equipment and sat across from him. What followed stunned every officer in the building. Apodaca began describing murders that had haunted the department for more than 30 years. He started with Althea Oakeley. He knew details about her death that had never been made public. The location, the method, things only the killer would know. Detectives exchanged glances. This wasn't a crank call. This wasn't someone seeking attention. This man was actually confessing to Althea's murder. He moved on to Kaitlyn Arquette. He described shooting her as she drove home. He explained why. He provided details that matched the crime scene. Then, he confessed to killing 13-year-old Stella Gonzalez, a case from years earlier that had also remained unsolved. The interview lasted hours. Detectives took careful notes, asked questions, verified details. Apodaca's knowledge was specific and accurate. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering. These were his crimes, and he was finally acknowledging them. When the interview ended, detectives sat in silence for a moment. They had just solved 3 cold cases in a single afternoon, cases that had consumed resources, haunted families, and defined careers. A man had walked in off the street and confessed to them all, but even as relief washed over them, questions emerged. Why now? Why after all these years? And most importantly, would the confessions hold up in court? The days following Apodaca's confession moved with controlled urgency. Detectives pulled every file related to the 3 murders. They compared his statements to evidence, looking for inconsistencies. They found none. His confessions aligned with facts known only to investigators. Paul Raymond Apodaca had a criminal history. He had been arrested multiple times over the years for various offenses, including sexual assault. He had lived a transient life, moving through New Mexico, staying under the radar. He had been questioned in connection with other crimes but never charged with these murders. Now, sitting in custody, he seemed almost relieved. The burden of his secrets had been crushing. Whatever had motivated him, guilt, fear, exhaustion, he had chosen to speak, and his words were destroying the silence that had protected him for decades. Prosecutors were notified immediately. They reviewed the confessions with detectives, analyzing every word. They knew defense attorneys would challenge the statements, looking for any reason to suppress them. The confessions had to be legally sound. Apodaca had been read his rights. He had waived them voluntarily. He had not been coerced. The recordings were clear, but prosecutors needed more than just confessions. They needed corroborating evidence. They began building cases that combined Apodaca's admissions with physical evidence from the crime scenes. DNA that had been stored for years was re-examined. Forensic reports were updated. Timelines were reconstructed. Families were contacted. Detectives made difficult phone calls to people who had waited decades for this moment. Althea's aging mother received the news in her living room. She wept, not with joy but with a complex mix of emotions: relief, anger, grief renewed. Her daughter's killer had a name. Finally, Carrie Arquette learned about Apodaca's confession and felt her world tilt. For her entire adult life, her sister's murder had been an open wound. Her mother had died without seeing justice. Now, suddenly, there was a suspect, a confession, the possibility of accountability. She called her siblings. They gathered together, trying to process the news. The media caught wind of the developments. News vans appeared outside the police department. Reporters requested statements. The department released minimal information. A suspect was in custody in connection with multiple cold case homicides. Details would follow. In August 2021, a grand jury convened. prosecutors presented evidence for Althea Oakeley's murder. They played portions of Apodaca's confession. They showed how his statements matched evidence. The grand jury deliberated and returned an Apodaca's indictment. Paul Raymond Apodaca was formally charged with Althea's murder, more than 33 years after her death. Apodaca's defense attorneys immediately began their work. Their job was to defend their client, and they would do so vigorously. They filed motions to suppress the confessions, arguing that Apodaca's rights had been violated. They claimed he had not been properly advised, that he had been under duress, that the confessions were not truly voluntary. The court held hearings. Prosecutors played the full recording of Apodaca's interview. Detectives testified about the procedures they followed. The defense presented their arguments. The judge listened carefully to both sides. In the end, the judge ruled that the confessions were admissible. Apodaca had been properly advised of his rights. He had waived them clearly and voluntarily. He had not been coerced or threatened. The recordings showed a man who wanted to confess. The evidence would stand. With that ruling, the prosecution's case strengthened considerably, but they weren't finished. Additional charges were filed. Apodaca was indicted for the murder of Stella Gonzalez. Then, charges related to Kaitlyn Arquette followed. Each case was built methodically, combining confessions with whatever physical evidence existed. Legal proceedings moved slowly, as they always do. Months passed. Court dates were set and delayed. Motions were filed and argued. The families attended hearings, sitting in the gallery, watching the man who had destroyed their lives. Apodaca appeared thin and tired, wearing jail scrubs, his hands shackled. Kaitlyn Arquette studied him, trying to understand how someone could commit such violence and then live normally for decades. What kind of person carries that darkness? What kind of soul kills strangers and then goes home for dinner? The defense explored plea deals. Trial would be risky for everyone. The confessions were powerful, but a jury could be unpredictable. Prosecutors were willing to negotiate, but they wanted a significant sentence. Apodaca had taken multiple lives. He had evaded justice for over 30 years. He needed to spend the rest of his life in prison. Through 2022 and 2023, negotiations continued. Evidence was reviewed and re-reviewed. Experts testified at pre-trial hearings. The cases moved through the legal system at a frustratingly slow pace. Families who had waited decades found themselves waiting more. But unlike the previous decades, this waiting had direction. The legal process was moving forward. Justice was no longer a distant hope, but an approaching certainty. In January 2024, a deal was reached. Paul Raymond Apodaca agreed to plead guilty to multiple charges related to the murders of Althea Oakeley, Kaitlyn Arquette, and Stella Gonzalez, as well as additional sexual assault charges. In exchange, prosecutors would not seek the death penalty. He would receive 45 years in prison. The plea hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in January. Families of the victims filled the courtroom. Media lined the back rows. Security was tight. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Apodaca was led into the courtroom. He looked older than his 56 years. The judge reviewed the charges with him, ensuring he understood what he was admitting. Did he commit these crimes? Yes, Apodaca said quietly. Did he understand the consequences? Yes. The judge accepted the plea. Then came victim impact statements. This was the family's opportunity to speak directly to the man who had destroyed them. They had prepared for this moment, some for decades. Althea's mother, now in her 80s and in a wheelchair, was helped to the front. Her voice was weak but clear. She spoke of her daughter's kindness, her dreams, the hole her death had left. She looked at Apodaca and said simply, "You stole her from us. You stole everything." She returned to her seat, supported by family members. Kaitlyn Arquette stood next. She held written remarks but spoke from memory. She described her sister Kaitlyn, her laugh, her energy, her love of life. She talked about her mother Lois, who had died without seeing this day. Then her voice hardened. She looked directly at Apodaca and said, "He murdered my family, not just my sister. He murdered all of us. He took our lives and twisted them into something dark." She urged the judge to ensure Apodaca would never be released, never have the chance to hurt anyone else. Other family members spoke, friends, shared memories. The courtroom filled with grief that had aged 3 decades, but lost none of its sharpness. Each speaker carved away at Apodaca's defenses, forcing him to confront the human cost of his violence. When they finished, the judge turned to sentencing. He reviewed the charges, the confessions, the evidence. He acknowledged the extraordinary length of time these cases had remained unsolved. He spoke about the importance of closure, even delayed closure, for families and communities. Then he sentenced Paul Raymond Apodaca to 45 years in prison. With his age and the length of the sentence, it was essentially a life term. Apodaca would die behind bars. The gavel fell. Guards escorted Apodaca away. He shuffled out of the courtroom without looking at the families. The proceedings were over. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Kaitlyn Arquette. She stood on the steps, wind whipping her hair, and spoke into microphones thrust toward her. Her voice carried the weight of decades. "This doesn't bring my sister back," she said. "It doesn't bring any of them back, but it's something. It's acknowledgement. It's accountability. For 35 years, we had nothing. Now we have truth." She was asked how she felt. She paused, searching for words. Relief, mixed with anger, mixed with sadness. "My mother died without seeing this. That hurts. But maybe she knows now. Maybe somehow she knows." Asked about the long wait, Carrie's expression hardened. The wait was torture. Every year that passed, we thought maybe this is it. Maybe this year we'll get answers. And every year ended in silence. That silence almost destroyed us. Inside the courthouse, detectives gathered in a conference room. They had watched the sentencing from the back of the courtroom. Now they sat in exhausted silence. One of them, a veteran detective who had worked all 3 cases, spoke quietly. "We never gave up," he said. "That's what people need to understand. We never closed these files. We kept looking. But sometimes, you need luck. Sometimes, you need a confession. We got both." Another detective nodded. "I'm glad the families got this. They deserved it. But it's bitter, you know? 30+ years. All those years he walked around free while they suffered." They discussed the case, replaying moments from the investigation. They talked about the day Apodaca walked in, how surreal it felt to hear him confess. They acknowledged the role of persistence, of refusing to let cases die even when hope seemed foolish. "The job is never to stop caring," one detective said. "Even when the trail is cold, even when everyone else has forgotten, we have to remember, that's the job." Television stations ran special reports that evening. They detailed the history of the cases, showed photos of the victims as they had been young, smiling, alive. They interviewed experts about cold case investigations, about how advances in forensics and dedicated units were solving crimes decades old. The story resonated beyond Albuquerque. National news picked it up. It became another example of justice delayed but not denied, of families who refused to stop fighting, of the power of truth eventually emerging. In the weeks following sentencing, the Albuquerque Police Department held a press conference specifically about the cold case unit's work. The chief stood at the podium, flanked by detectives. "These cases stayed with us," the chief said. "Every unsolved murder weighs on this department, but we want the public to know we don't give up. Technology changes, people's circumstances change. Eventually, in many cases, the truth emerges." He detailed advances in forensic science that had helped solve other cold cases. DNA phenotyping that could suggest a suspect's appearance, genetic genealogy that traced family trees, digital forensics that recovered old data. The tools available to modern investigators far exceeded what detectives had in 1988 and 1989. But he also acknowledged the role of human factors. "Sometimes," he said, "it takes a confession. Someone's conscience finally breaks. We saw that here." Paul Apodaca carried these secrets for over 30 years. Whatever his reasons, he chose to finally tell the truth. That confession, combined with the evidence we preserved, allowed us to close these cases. Reporters asked if there were other unsolved cases from the 1980s and 1990s that might see similar breakthroughs. The chief was honest. "We hope so. We're actively working several cold cases. Some have DNA evidence we're testing, some have witnesses we're re-interviewing. We want to give every family closure if we can." One of the detectives who had taken Apodaca's confession spoke about that day. "I've been in law enforcement for 25 years. That was one of the most surreal moments of my career. You work these cases, you hope, but you don't expect someone to just walk in and confess. When it happened, I thought maybe it was a prank. But as he kept talking, giving details only the killer would know, I realized this is it. This is the break we've been waiting for." He grew emotional, talking about the families. They waited so long. So much pain, so many anniversaries and birthdays and holidays without their loved ones, and the whole time, the person responsible was out there, free. That's not right, but at least now there's accountability. At least now they have answers. The press conference concluded with a reminder. Dozens of cold cases remained unsolved in Albuquerque. Families still waited for justice. The department committed to continuing its work, to never treating these cases as hopeless, to pursuing every possible lead. For the detectives involved, the Apodaca cases represented both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, that they had finally solved murders that had defined their careers. Tragedy, that it took so long, that the families suffered decades of uncertainty, that the killer lived free for so many years. One detective, preparing for retirement, cleaned out his desk. He found old notes from Althea's case, photocopies of reports, a faded copy of Althea's student ID photo. He had kept them all these years, a reminder of the case he couldn't solve. Now it was solved. He could retire knowing that justice, however delayed, had arrived. On a Saturday evening in February, community members gathered at a park near the University of New Mexico. Local advocacy groups had organized a candlelight vigil for victims of unsolved crimes and for families who had finally received justice. More than 200 people attended. They held candles that flickered in the winter darkness. Organizers set up photos of Althea Oakeley and Kaitlyn Arquette on easels at the front. Younger attendees, people who had been children or unborn when the murders occurred, looked at the photos and tried to comprehend the tragedy. A speaker addressed the crowd. She talked about the importance of remembering victims as people, not just as case numbers. Althea loved music, she said. She wanted to be a teacher. She baked cookies for her friends. Kaitlyn was creative and independent. She was close to her family. They were real people with real lives. We honor them by remembering who they were. Kaitlyn Arquette attended with her family. She spoke briefly, thanking everyone for coming, for not forgetting. My sister's case became famous because my mother was an author, she said. But there are so many victims whose families don't have that platform. They need support too. They need to know people care. Althea's family was also present. Her sister read a poem Althea had written in high school. Her voice broke multiple times, but she finished. The crowd stood in respectful silence. A representative from a non-profit that supported families of murder victims spoke about resources available. She acknowledged the unique pain of waiting decades for answers. The grief doesn't get smaller, she said. You just get stronger carrying it. And when justice finally comes, it doesn't erase the grief, but it helps. It validates that your loved one mattered, that their death mattered, that someone is being held accountable. The vigil included a moment of silence. 200 people stood in the dark, candles burning, thinking about violence and loss, and the fragility of life. In that silence, the city acknowledged its wounds, both old and new. As people began to disperse, some approached the families to offer condolences. Strangers hugged Carrie, telling her they had followed Kaitlyn's case for years, that they had never stopped hoping for justice. Others spoke quietly with Althea's family, expressing relief that the case was solved. The photos of Althea and Kaitlyn remained on the easels, illuminated by candlelight. Two young women frozen in time, forever 21 and 18, their deaths had defined decades. Their memories would outlast their killer. Weeks later, Kaitlyn Arquette drove to the cemetery where her sister was buried. She had visited countless times over the years, birthdays, anniversaries, random days when grief felt too heavy. But this visit felt different. She carried news. The case was closed. The killer was in prison. She knelt beside the headstone. Kaitlyn Arquette, beloved daughter and sister, born 1970, died 1989. The dates carved in granite, marking a life cut impossibly short. Carrie traced the letters of her sister's name. We got him, she whispered. It took forever. Mom didn't live to see it, but we got him. He's going to die in prison. She placed fresh flowers, the kind Kaitlyn had loved. She sat on the grass, letting memories wash over her. Kaitlyn laughing, Kaitlyn singing, Kaitlyn planning her future. All of it stolen by a man who hadn't even known her. I hope you're at peace, Carrie said. I hope Mom found you, wherever you both are. I hope you know we never stopped fighting for you. Never. She stayed until the sun began to set, the sky turning orange and purple over the Sandia Mountains. Finally, she stood, touched the headstone one more time, and walked back to her car. Across the city, Althea's mother made a similar pilgrimage. She was too frail to kneel, so family members helped her place flowers. She stared at her daughter's grave, a place she had visited thousands of times over 36 years. We finally know, she said softly. We finally know who and why. It doesn't bring you back. Nothing can do that, but at least we know. Her daughter helped her back to the car. As they drove away, she looked back at the cemetery. So many people rested there, each with their own story. Althea's story was complete now. The final chapter had been written. In his prison cell, Paul Raymond Apodaca lay on a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. He would spend the rest of his life here, in this small room, cut off from the world. The secrets that had weighed on him were no longer secret. The confessions had freed him in one way, imprisoned him in another. He thought about the women he had killed. Their faces haunted him, though he tried not to think about them. He had destroyed families, stolen futures, created decades of pain. The guilt he felt was a physical weight, crushing his chest. But guilt changed nothing. The dead remained dead. The families remained broken. His imprisonment gave them closure but couldn't undo the harm. He would die here, alone, having taken more from the world than he could ever repay. The Albuquerque community moved forward, carrying the lessons of these cases with them. The police department continued working unsolved murders, always aware that somewhere, families waited for answers. Forensic techniques kept advancing. Genetic genealogy led to more arrests in cold cases nationwide. DNA databases expanded. Digital tools improved. The message was clear. Even old crimes could be solved. Even decades-old secrets could be revealed. Victim advocacy groups grew stronger. They pushed for resources, for cold case units to be properly funded, for rape kits to be tested promptly. They fought to ensure victims and their families were treated with dignity throughout the legal process. The pain of long delays motivated policy changes. For Kaitlyn Arquette and Althea's family, life continued. Shaped forever by loss but no longer defined by uncertainty. They had their answer. The person responsible was behind bars. They could finally move forward, knowing justice had been served. Kaitlyn occasionally gave interviews about cold cases, about the importance of never giving up. She spoke at conferences, encouraging other families to keep pushing, keep asking questions, keep demanding accountability. Her mother's legacy of advocacy lived on through her. On quiet evenings, she would think about Kaitlyn, not about the murder, not about the decades of pain, but about who Kaitlyn had been, her laughter, her creativity, her kindness. Those memories, untainted by violence, were what Kaitlyn chose to carry forward. Althea's family did the same. They remembered her gentleness, her love of teaching, her ability to make people feel heard. The manner of her death didn't define her life defined her. The cases of Althea Oakeley and Kaitlyn Arquette joined the long list of crimes solved decades after they occurred. They became examples, cited in training sessions for cold case detectives. They appeared in true crime documentaries as success stories. They demonstrated that persistence, technology, and sometimes luck could overcome even the coldest trails. But for those who lived through it, the cases were not just stories or statistics. They were real pain, real loss, real decades of uncertainty. The resolution brought relief, but it couldn't restore what was taken. Justice, though late, had finally arrived. The wounds remained, but the silence had ended. In the end, that was what mattered most. The truth had emerged. The guilty were held accountable. The victims were remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. And in a city that had carried the weight of these unsolved murders for more than 3 decades, there was finally, at long last, closure.